Welcome to Qualified Opinions, where we test the ideas and limits, the knowns and known unknowns around freedom and order in contemporary politics and society. We invite you to listen as we engage with leading and emerging thinkers across disciplines and issues who will sharpen our thinking on the topics shaping our discourse. Welcome back. Today we're diving into a special episode of Qualified Opinions. Unless you've been living under a rock or maybe enjoying a peaceful, news-free vacation, lucky you, you've probably heard all the buzz about the Harris Walz campaign. It's fun, it's joyful, and for the most part, it's very, very light on policy substance. The Democratic National Convention in Chicago this week was close to a policy desert. But fear not, dear listeners, we're here to quench your thirst for actual substance. I've asked two policy wonks who've been on the trail of the Democratic duo to come and tell us what they think it will mean policy-wise if we have a Harris Walz White House starting in January. Dominic Pino is a Thomas L. Rhodes Fellow at the National Review Institute. He's also the host of AIER Econception. And Akash Chougule is Vice President of Americans for Prosperity. Welcome, guys.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, thanks.
Okay, so I thought we would do something a little different today. And I wanted to have you because first, something that everyone talks about is how this election is really substance-free. I mean, we're here mostly to talk about the Democrats, but it seems it's true also on the Republican side that kind of we've broke away from substance all around. Is this just, am I wrong or Dominic?
No, I don't think you're wrong at all, Vero. I think this is largely a substance-free campaign. I don't think either side, I know for sure the Democrats don't. I believe it's also true of the Republicans that neither side has an issues tab on their campaign website. So there is no way you could actually even figure out what they think about anything. And it's really unfortunate that that's the case because 2025, which will be the first year of this administration for whoever wins, is going to present some serious policy challenges. We know that the individual provisions of the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act all expire in 2025. And so there's going to be a big debate in Congress, and the president is going to have to be involved in that about what to do about those tax cuts. It's also true that a bunch of subsidies for Obamacare expire. It's also true that a bunch of contract authority from the infrastructure law expires. It's also true that a bunch of funding for state and local governments will expire. And so there's really, really serious policy problems that are coming up in 2025. And no matter who wins, that president is going to have to deal with them. And it doesn't seem like either candidate has any plan about what they would do when they get into the Oval Office.
Yeah. And in fact, 2025 is interesting because it literally starts January 1st with the restoration of the debt ceiling, and it ends December 31st with the expiration of all the individual provision in the Trump tax cuts. So Akash, let me ask you, it didn't used to be this way, right? Am I dreaming, or is it kind of in the good old days? It seems, I think I remember that there was somewhat of a place for us policy people to talk and debate policies during campaigns.
Yeah, that seems true. And I think those debates still exist, to Dominic's point, right? I think you see candidates for Congress running on some of these things. Speaker Johnson is on the campaign trail emphasizing for example, the reconciliation bill that he wants House Republicans to advance. But I think right now what you're seeing is we remain a very evenly divided country. And come every election cycle, the American people seem to want things to change, but they're not sure how they want things to change. And I think you're seeing two major parties respond to that. We're obviously in a more populist moment. And so I think there are some debates, as we've discussed, particularly on the Republican side, about what it means to be a conservative on some of these issues. Whereas on the Democratic side, it's just kind of different versions of who can be more extreme and kind of the big government progressive viewpoint. But beyond that, there doesn't seem to be a lot of specificity. Even if you just go back to President Obama, for example, he obviously ran on some pretty concrete promises, ones that we all probably disagree with largely, but and tried to act on them as president, whether it was the Affordable Care Act or it was Dodd-Frank or it was card check on labor policy. So these were kind of concrete promises he made, things that he ran on. You just don't see that level of detail anymore, which I think is unfortunate. But whether or not people are campaigning on them, policymakers will have to address them come next year.
Yeah, I mean, it's a good point. I've heard that when it comes to the Harris campaign, I mean, the vagueness about details on policy is actually intentional because they want to actually preserve the momentum going. But there's still a few things first that we know, because it's not as if, they're in power right now, the Democrats, for all their attempt to actually pretend that they're not, and that somehow on day one, it will be a completely different person, like a party getting in power. I mean, they're in power. So there are things we know about what her policies would look like. And there are also a few things that they have said, whether through her campaign or that she's said directly. So I want to actually kind of read from last night. Minnesota Governor Tim Walz at the Democratic National Convention. He gave us, like, I think this is like the only thing that has been said during the DNC in the last 3 days, what the program would be like. He said, if you're a middle class family or a family trying to get into the middle class, Kamala Harris is going to cut your taxes. If you're getting squeezed by the price of your prescription drugs, Kamala Harris is going to take on big pharma. If you're hoping to buy a home, Kamala Harris is going to help make it more affordable. And no matter who you are, Kamala Harris is going to stand up and fight for your freedom to live the life you want to lead, because that's what we want for ourselves, and that's what we want for our neighbors. So, Akash, let me start with you. I mean, Kamala Harris is going to cut middle class taxes? Really? I mean,
it's a testament to all of us and the work that we've done that you have even Democrats running on tax cuts, and let alone any Democrat, but a sitting governor who has done the exact opposite, right? He has actually raised taxes significantly in his state, but understands how unpopular that would be at a national level. And so I think it's a rhetorical victory for limited government advocates that you have Democrats running on tax cuts. Now, the great irony, the two things jumped out at me from those statements from Governor Walz last night. One is when you talk about middle class costs of living, I mean, Kamala Harris is in office right now as vice president, and she cast the deciding votes on two of the biggest spending bills that created this inflation crisis. Democrats spent $6 trillion above baseline the first 2 years of the Biden-Harris administration when Nancy Pelosi was speaker through the American Rescue Plan. And you'll remember Kamala Harris parading around the country saying, help is on the way after that passed. And then same for the Inflation Reduction Act. She passed the tie-breaking vote. Those two things juiced inflation, and prices are up almost 20% as a result. And so Kamala Harris has herself decimated affordability for the middle class. The other thing that I find to be very ironic is talk of protecting Medicare. The Inflation Reduction Act actually took money away from Medicare to pay for electric vehicle subsidies. Let me repeat that. The Inflation Reduction Act took money away from Medicare to pay for electric vehicle subsidies, and seniors are now facing a Medicare premium increase as a result of Kamala Harris casting the tie-breaking vote. And so we don't need to play sort of theoretical games. We know what her track record is, and it's the opposite of what Tim Walz said she'd do as president.
Can you explain this? And then, Dominic, I'm going to turn to you to talk about the corporate income tax part of that tax cut vision. So can you explain to us how it works?
Yeah, the Medicare, the Inflation Reduction Act. Yeah, I mean, they essentially, it really is quite simple. They diverted Medicare funds away from Medicare in order to help pay for the Inflation Reduction Act. One of the major spending items in the Inflation Reduction Act were these tax credits for electric vehicles, which of course cost money on the ledger of the federal government.
And which was supposed to be, I think, total of less than $400 billion, and which is scheduled over 10 years and scheduled now to be over, I think, $1.2 trillion, right?
That's exactly right. And they're now trying to paper over this premium increase. But the fact of the matter is a law for which she cast a tie-breaking vote inflicted this potential pain onto seniors on Medicare.
Yeah. So the reason why I was kind of so amazed with this statement is like, on one hand, yes, when the individual portion of the Trump tax cuts expire, right? Right now, they're scheduled by, like CBO, they're projected as if there's a tax increase coming our way. And that includes taxes for the middle class. And so one charitable way of seeing this is, since the Democrats very likely, for all their talk about wanting to raise taxes, are going to support extending those individual taxes, right? That could be seen as her cutting taxes for the middle class, when in fact, it was never really in the cards that those were going to expire. But she also that's one of the few things she's been explicit about, is that she wants to increase the corporate income tax from 21% to 28%. And as I like to say all the time, this is really not a populist measure. Dominic, what do you think?
Yeah, the corporate income tax is a trick that we play on ourselves to get us to believe that some evil corporation is paying the taxes and not actual American people. But only people can pay taxes. And the corporate income tax, the incidence of it falls, in part on workers, in part on the company. And that results in lower pay for workers and lower investment by the company. And that lower investment helps to harm productivity growth. It makes it harder for businesses to hire more workers in the future because they'll be less productive. And so the corporate income tax is a really damaging tax. It's a much more damaging tax to long-term economic growth than, say, a sales tax or even the individual income tax. And so raising the corporate income tax is a really bad idea. And that's a lesson that lots of other countries have already learned. The United States, before the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, had the highest corporate income tax rate in the developed world. Our corporate income tax rate was higher than China. It was higher than Venezuela. It was higher than lots of countries that we think of as being hostile to freedom in general. And the corporate income tax under the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act was reduced to 21%, which is about the global average. And so we went from being one of the highest in the world to just being average. We don't even have a low corporate income tax right now. But to put it from 21% back to 28%, and you got to remember there's about 4 or 5 more points on that because the average state also has a corporate income tax that'll add about 4 or 5 percentage points to that. So we're talking about, the low 30s as for the total for most companies. That's a really, really big impediment to U.S. economic growth, and it's not something that we should want to do. On top of that, the corporate income tax relative to the individual income tax or payroll taxes doesn't raise that much money either. And so the hit to the budget is small compared to cutting those other kinds of taxes, and the benefit in more economic growth is much larger than it is for cutting those other kinds of taxes. But again, it's this unpopular thing because it sounds like you're taxing these evil rich guys, when in fact you're actually just taxing Americans both in the present and in the future through lower economic growth.
Yeah, the Committee for Responsible Budget had an estimate this week that calculated how much revenue would be raised from raising the corporate income tax from 21 to 28%. And it was, I think it was $1 trillion over 10 years. I mean, considering that we are heading to $2.8 trillion of deficit in 10 years in 2034, I guess, is really actually, this is not gonna do, but it is, they're like, according to the IMF, according to the OECD, these are not like, bastions of libertarians. It's like the corporate income tax, and raising the corporate income tax is the most distortive way to actually raise revenue.
And the long run trend around the world is for lower corporate taxes, right? So if you can go back to the 90s, that was sort of the peak of a lot of corporate taxes. If you look at countries in Europe and countries elsewhere in the world, but sort of the other high income countries, they've all been gradually reducing their corporate income taxes over the years and that's true for left wing parties and right wing parties when they're in government, because they realize how destructive this tax is.
And it's also worth saying that what 21% seems low, I mean, it's average, but when you add, as you said, the state average, we're higher than China, and we're basically where France is. And it's never a good place to be. So Akash, I also read that I think it's her campaign told the Committee for Responsible Budget that Harris planned on basically she supported all the tax increases that were in the Biden's budget. I mean, what does this look like?
Yeah, so I'll give you two examples that jumped out yesterday that were making quite a bit of news where she supports, one, a massive increase in the capital gains tax, and then the other is a tax on unrealized gains. Now, let's kind of dissect these. Dominic did a great job talking about the corporate income tax rate, which, of course, raising that will mean fewer job opportunities and less wage growth. If we take capital gains, right, one of the things that is essential for economic growth is saving and investing, right? So that we're using capital responsibly. It's being invested in the most pro-growth manner possible. Raising taxes on capital gains is going to be an enormous wet blanket on exactly the kind of saving and investing that creates economic growth. The other point being the capital gains tax is already double taxation. Those dollars have already been taxed either once or twice, depending on how you're counting, as far as whether they've been taxed as corporate income already, and potentially sometimes also subject to consumption taxes. And so raising the capital gains tax rate is damaging in and of itself. The latter, this tax on unrealized gains, this is one, unconstitutional for a variety of reasons. But let's just think about, and this will only, as of right now, as laid out, apply to those with assets over $100 million. But as we all know, taxes never shrink the number of people who they apply to. They always inevitably grow the number of people to whom they apply. This would be no different. And so people should take no solace in the fact that it only applies above $100 million. Unrealized gains mean that as the value of something increases, even though that value increases only on paper, you're not any cash wealthier as your asset increases in value. You would have to pay taxes on that value increase. Now, in order to actually have the cash to pay that tax, you would often have to sell that asset, right? And so then you're having these transfers and decisions made around the tax burden rather than what actually makes sense for individuals, families, and businesses. It's a completely insane system. And I'll give you a small example where we see this work in another tax, and that's the death tax or the estate tax on small family farms. Often the same principle applies where they're not actually able to pay that tax bill when they pass it from one generation to the next because of the value that's accrued. And so people end up selling these small family farms just to pay that tax bill. You would see a lot of that if there were to be a tax on unrealized gains. But of course, again, it's unconstitutional. It would never fly. And so these promises amount to little more than just, unfortunately, Vero, class warfare that Kamala Harris thinks is going to win votes.
And the Biden budget specifically has for the death tax, it has it applied to unrealized gains. And I don't exactly know the details, whether it's actually, because right now there's a $5 million deduction, right? And I don't know exactly what it means, but there's also the Biden White House has been actually quite explicit about the fact that it liked this idea of taxing unrealized gains. There's a paper in 2021 put out by the Council of Economic Advisors specifically that reference like taxing unrealized gains, whether for the death tax or others, a large number of times. So, you know, what's absent of the discussion, like for the most part, even though it's a real concern for the American people, is inflation. Inflation is like the Democrats don't talk about it, and they don't talk about it in large part because then we could say, hey, you largely contributed to doing some of this. But they are talking to the concern of people, the affordability concern of people. So either of you, do you want to take on the way we think, because of what they've said, like especially VP Harris have said about how they will tackle the affordability issue?
I think I would just have one initial thought, and I'd be curious what Dominic thinks. But one of the things they've always been very good at is packaging up talking points into one sentence and selling them to the American people, no matter how nonsensical they are, right? And so for housing, it's let's give every home buyer $25,000, or let's go after corporate price gouging for food prices. But there's much more that meets the eye here. So, for example, grocery stores have an average profit margin last year of 1%. Grocery stores are not price gouging people, but again, it sounds very easy to scapegoat them for high prices. I think what's more indicative is this example of trying to throw money at a problem to make it more affordable. We have seen fail in every single instance government has tried this. It has failed in healthcare. It has failed in higher education. It will fail in housing, which is that when government throws money at an industry, the industry sees the government as an endless pile of cash. And so they can raise costs accordingly, which does nothing for access. It makes things more inaccessible, harms quality, and ultimately raises costs rather than brings them down. The Democrats have done this over and over again when they've had power. And I think to double down on that, even though it's an easy talking point, does nothing to solve affordability problems for the average family.
So, Dominic, there's been a lot of talking about price controls since last week, because I think it was 10 days ago, the campaign floated the idea that she would do effectively a ban on price gouging. It mentioned using the FTC, and then there was a lots of pushback with the idea. Now they're kind of trying to really distance themselves from the idea that it's price control. But I mean, what do you think? Do they want price control?
I think they don't have any way of actually doing it. I think it runs into the problem that Akash was talking about with the unrealized gains tax, which is clearly unconstitutional. This wouldn't necessarily be unconstitutional, but it could be, depending on how you look at it, but it would certainly be something that would be an overstep of the authority that's actually given to the Federal Trade Commission. And so we just saw the FTC's ban on non-compete agreements get struck down by the courts for overstepping its executive authority. And I think it would be a similar thing here if they wanted to do this. I think we need to talk as well, if we're talking about inflation, we need to talk about the one price control that's right at the center of our economy, which is interest rates, which the Federal Reserve sets by the Federal Open Markets Committee. And we had for about 15 years extremely low interest rates near zero. We had money that was basically free. And for a long time, this did not cause price inflation, consumer price inflation. And so everyone thought it was fine. But what it did cause is asset price inflation. And that's why you see real estate values, the values on weird things like, art collections and things like that. All of the values on that stuff and the values of the stock market, all the values on that stuff went through the roof. And that has been good for some people, certainly for people who own those assets. It's good for them, but it's not good for people who are looking to buy them. And so this is part of the reason for housing affordability problems, but it's also a problem because for the longest time, if you have very low interest rates, you can make a lot of really bad business decisions and get away with them because you can just keep borrowing money to paper it over. And so this is part of the cause of, sort of stagnation in the economy in other ways, is that you don't have the creative destruction that's supposed to be part of the capitalist system. In a downturn, that's supposed to help kind of wipe away some of the bad ideas, reallocate those resources back to better ideas that end up being profitable. But when you don't have the interest rate mechanism operating as it should, that doesn't really happen. And really for the last year, we've actually had pretty sensible monetary policy, but people think it's a really high interest rate. But if you look at it historically, we have very average interest rates right now. And so it'll be interesting to see what happens with that, because politicians always want easy money. They love easy money, and they're going to start begging the Federal Reserve, as our investors, by the way, are going to start begging the Federal Reserve to cut interest rates back to those zero levels that we had in the past. That was bad for the economy as well. And it was bad in a different way than high interest rates are bad. But it was still bad. And that's something that we need to pay more attention to. Fortunately, politicians are not directly in control of the interest rate. Fortunately, that is the Federal Reserve, which makes plenty of mistakes, but it's better than having politicians in charge of it. But we need to sort of get that price control situation figured out if we want to have better economic growth in the future.
Yeah, I mean, I also think that there's a moment where the economy is so mismanaged and they're so bad on spending that it won't matter what the Federal Reserve does. I mean, investors in global markets at some point may really, and I think to some extent they already have. And I think we're going to see lingering high interest rates for a fairly long time. If the example of the inflation of the 1970s and 80s kind of repeats itself, and I mean, you saw that long after inflation was gone, interest rates remained high for a long time, which is a big problem for us, considering that so much of our debt is short term. A third of our debt as a maturity of less than a year. A lot of that in that third, a lot of it is a maturity of 2 weeks, 3 months. I mean, it's really high turnover, and so these high rates, are a really big deal. And that, and again, leads me to say, and another things that no one's talking about during this campaign, and certainly not the Democrats, is at the very least, the Republicans, I guess, are paying lip service. I mean, it's like meaningless, but spending. No one's talking about spending.
Yeah, I do think there is, to Dominic's point earlier, there is a real inflection point next year, both legislatively, but also right now politically, which is that, the hand of government over the last 4 years has touched people more in ways just in the last couple of years than it has perhaps in people's entire lifetimes, between COVID restrictions to gas prices to the inflation crisis driven by spending. And so we're all well aware of how difficult it can be to connect overspending to people's lives. I think right now, Republican lawmakers or conservatives, anyone who really cares about this issue, has an opportunity to make that connection, which is that your life is expensive because the government spent too much money. And they have an inflection point legislatively, as Dominic mentioned, where they have to do something about it, right? There's the debate over the tax bill, that can be paid for as much as possible. There's a debate over the debt ceiling. There's the annual debates over government funding. There can be fights over real enforceable spending caps. And so I think there is this moment politically and then a moment legislatively to actually do something about it. Something will have to be done next year, as Dominic mentioned, on these legislative inflection points. And I think it's incumbent on all of us and candidates and political parties to continue to hammer home the message that spending does matter to people. It's a political winning issue, and it must be governed on to actually make people's lives better. I think it's actually a fairly rare opportunity, as much as we all talk about spending. I think the last time was 2010 where people talked about it in this manner. And so we do have a rare opportunity that I think is worth continuing to hammer home as we head into November and into January.
Well, let me ask you this. I know that on the House Republican side, there's a lot of talking about offsetting some of the tax cuts. I mean, there's that's actually something that's new and is a good development, this talking about offsetting tax cuts. Do you think that there's any scenario in which the Democrats are willing to do this and to offset some of the tax increase? And also, would they be willing to offset it with some spending cuts?
I find it very, very hard to believe, which is that all spending cuts it's possible to demagogue any spending cut. We saw this a few years ago with that debate over rescinding unspent funds. If I recall correctly, it was something like 15 billion with a B. It was like a literal drop in the bucket. And you saw people demagoguing it as though it was going to be a revision of Paul Ryan rolling Granny off a cliff from 2012. I mean, the debate was just absolutely ridiculous. And I think that's become the pervading narrative, not necessarily that all Democratic lawmakers even believe that, but I think the fear tactics of left-leaning outside groups to do that and attack Democratic lawmakers probably scares them away from doing so, which I think necessitates courage on the Republican side all the more to really grab this opportunity by the horns.
So, Dominic, I mean, spending, is there anyone interested in tackling anything that has to do with spending?
Well, there should be, because spending is the problem here. We have federal revenue is projected to be pretty stable over the next 30 years, according to the Congressional Budget Office. So they think they're going to pull in about 16 to 18% of GDP in revenue from basically now until the end of time. But the problem is that spending is going to keep going up as a share of GDP. And so that is what's creating the gap. We do not have a revenue problem. We have a spending problem. And and we know from other countries that have had fiscal crises, they had to cut spending in order to get their situation back under control. They could not tax their way out of the problem. And we saw this in countries like Sweden, for example, which a lot of people think of as a socialist country. And it used to be a much more socialist country until they did what Margaret Thatcher talked about in the 80s, which is that they ran out of other people's money. And they did that in the mid-1990s, and under a conservative government there, they did a lot of really serious spending reforms. They reformed their entitlement programs. They privatized part of their pension system. And as a result of that, they have been one of the best performing major economies since then. They have their debt problem is entirely under control. And it's a pretty stable consensus there, actually, in their political system now. The left-wing party, the Social Democratic Party, is nowhere near as far left as it used to be because they realize that this just doesn't work. And so I think at some point, reality will force that. It'll look different in the United States than it will other places because a lot of times these problems come from balance of payments crises, which is not really a problem the United States has because we have the world's reserve currency. And so it's going to look like something different. It's probably going to have to do with bondholders being unwilling to buy bonds at the rates that the Treasury is offering, something like that. Will wake people up and force them to do something about it. But look, the spending is going to have to come down at some point. And so it's much better for us to have ideas on the shelf right now about what we would do when that crisis presents itself. And there are lots of ideas that are coming out of think tanks and different organizations in Washington, D.C. about how to solve these problems. There's just not really any politicians taking up those ideas at the moment because we haven't gotten to that point yet. It's unfortunate that it'll probably take us getting to that point in order for this to happen, but once we get there, there will be some ideas on the shelf ready to go, and we just need to actually have some leadership that will be honest with the American people, because that's what it really comes down to. This is an entirely predictable problem. We have lots of unpredictable problems that come up in government, right? Foreign countries invade each other. We have, crises in the economy that lead to recessions, natural disasters. All that stuff is very unpredictable. This, on the other hand, is completely predictable. We know it's coming, and when we get there, we'll need to be able to figure out how to solve it.
I assume the two of you are with me that everything in the budget should be on the table for review and potential cuts. But the truth of the matter is that when we're talking about the need for government spending reform, we're talking about two programs. We're talking about Social Security and Medicare, right? I assume you guys are on board. And I mean, this is one area where both sides, are just, are really pandering. They're talking about how we shouldn't touch, they won't touch these programs. And of course, it's not a good idea to not touch this program for a variety of reasons, but in part because actually not touching them means a pretty big cut, certainly for Social Security when the time comes. Do you think they really will wait until the last moment, which means right now, 2034, right, for Social Security and a little later for Medicare?
Yeah, I mean,
is that what we think?
I think that's been the track record of government, which is that they don't act until there's a crisis requiring them to act. And what you're alluding to for Social Security is that there is a 23% cut in Social Security benefits written into the law right now. And so all these people running on not touching Social Security, they are de facto running on cutting Social Security benefits by 23% within the next decade. Donald Trump did that. Joe Biden did that. Kamala Harris did that. The only two people, if folks remember, in the Republican presidential primary who were honest about this problem and who made this point were Vice President Mike Pence and Ambassador Nikki Haley. And both of them got demagogued for telling us the truth, which is that your Social Security benefits will be cut if we do nothing. Therefore, we need to address these programs. Now, I think the problem you're alluding to, which is that not only is it far off and people are afraid, I mean, we even saw this unfold in Congress. You'll recall when Mike Johnson became Speaker of the House. I mean, he's a limited government conservative. He was honest about this problem, at least to the extent that he wanted to put forward a debt commission, right? A budget commission to study this issue, start developing solutions, bring both sides to the table. I mean, even the idea of a commission debating this was demagogued so much that idea was ultimately abandoned from a speaker who was finally championing the need to be serious about spending. And so I don't see any indication of that changing until we're in a campaign cycle and facing that problem head on, where there is no choice but to address it before people's benefits start to be cut.
So no one wants to talk about spending, but there's a lot of really implicit talk about more spending, right? So the Biden administration was very heavy on industrial policy for green energy. We've already talked about this. Do you guys see that being the same with a Harris Walz?
Yeah, I think so. Absolutely. I think Democrats think that this is the way to manage the economy. I don't think they view it as a mistake or something they need to retreat from. I think that they think that markets don't work, and they think that the government can direct that activity better by providing capital to the industries that they think need it. And of course, that comes with lots of different problems like public corruption. Most of it's perfectly legal corruption, by the way. It's not like they're breaking the law here, but in lots of cases, these are companies that support Democrats, and so it helps them to keep that money coming, and it all comes with unionization and public sector unions and private sector unions as well, which also support Democrats. We've seen a lot of this extra financial support for state and local governments has made the public sector unions very happy. That came in the American Rescue Plan Act from Democrats, despite there not being deficits in states. The states all ran surpluses during COVID, but they got a ton of extra money from the feds and used that to start all sorts of different programs. And so, I think Democrats think that this is how they should run the economy. We've seen no retreat in Harris's platform from all of this stuff. In fact, to the extent that she mentions things that Biden did, she basically just says she's going to do them bigger. This was with the $25,000 housing money that you talked about earlier. That was a Biden proposal first, and it was originally only for first-generation home buyers. Now, Harris wants to extend that to all first-time home buyers. So it doesn't matter whether your parents were homeowners or not. It's every first-time home buyer would get this $25,000 that she wants to give out. She wants to expand the child tax credit by more than Biden did. She wants to expand. So all of this stuff.
Because she has the $6,000 child tax credit for the first year, right?
Mm-hmm,
when you're born.
So all of this is just Biden plus. So she doesn't seem to think that there was anything wrong with this, and it's a very weird spot for her because her economic message is basically that the housing market's a disaster. You're overtaxed. This is there's a bunch of big greedy companies out there that are just stealing all your money. And the answer to this is to do the same thing that we've been doing the last 3.5 years. And so it's a very peculiar message from the Democrats on this. And it'll be interesting to see whether voters notice that doesn't make any sense, or whether the continued sort of media hype around Harris will just be able to carry her through to the election day.
It seems to me that there's a real danger in a continuation like this of the green program. Like, just take EVs, only just take just that part of the agenda, right? It was one thing for Biden to do it and to say, we're going to put all these tax credits, we're going to put all these mandates, we're going to do, and there was a lot of this in the Inflation Reduction Act, in the infrastructure bill. There's certainly a ton of this, but we've already seeing, right, the market push back against EVs. And I don't think this is going to improve. So it seems to me that an effectively second Biden term with Harris at the helm, and doing exactly the same thing is going to actually face even more of the market reality of the policies.
But I think to Dominic's point, what you'll see as a result of that is just more doubling down, which is that they would see that as a market failure and the need for government to be even more proactive in this space because people are not responding to the existing levels of incentives. And so therefore we need more incentives, right? We need more incentives for electric vehicles and for solar energy and, in domestic manufacturing or whatever the case might be, or in union labor. You're going to see more and more gradually the role of government increase further and further when the market responds alternatively to what they wish, not a recognition of the fact that the market is rejecting their agenda.
But so what happens to the car companies that are moving? I read they're getting behind schedule, or they are even announcing. Dominic, I think you've written about this. They're also announcing that they're basically suspending electric cars production, right?
We've already set. They've already set the expectation that the government has already set the expectation that if anything goes wrong with the car companies, they're going to get bailed out. And this happened during the financial crisis. It'll happen again because the car companies have been extremely obedient and extremely subservient to government, and they know that that's in their best interest to do, because if they're on good terms with the politicians, when they run out of room to keep doing business, the federal government will step in and bail them out. So I think that they don't view this as a problem necessarily. And I think that's one of the real issues that we have is we don't have actual private sector, at least on the electric vehicle area. We don't have the private sector standing up for itself against the government. We have them viewing the government as a partner and them working as a team on a lot of this stuff. And so that's where we could have many more problems down the road. And that's where taxpayers are going to end up being on the hook for this again. We were on the hook for it already with all the tax credits, but we'll be on the hook for it again when they go out of business for doing stuff that's obviously the market's not ready for.
What about unions? I mean, during this campaign, they really haven't talked. It's so weird. This campaign is so weird. I mean, when you listen to them, it's all about opportunity. They're basically taking over the language of the Republicans, a while back, right? It's opportunity, and it's kind of all like, they don't talk about economic growth, but they want to kind of promote everyone's ability to be who they want to be and what they can do. But they're not really talking, for instance, about the stuff that they've been doing the last 4 years. And so unions have been really at the center of the Biden-Harris first term. And I know that the first night at the convention, right, there was the mayor of Chicago was there, right? And Dominic, you wrote about this, about how, Chicago is kind of a role model with what a union-driven state policy, like a town or policy looks like. But what do you think? Do you think we're with Harris and Walz, this is where we're heading? We're heading towards a Chicago model?
Well, fortunately, the American people have been rejecting unionization for decades now. So you kind of look at, Michael Watson at the Capital Research Center calls it the long decline from basically 1950 all the way through to today. We've just seen a decline in union membership in the United States. And that's regardless of who's president. It's regardless of who controls Congress. That has just been happening because as workers, and they do in a majority of states now, as workers have the ability to choose whether to join a union or not. Most people choose not to. And that there's a variety of reasons for that.
How many, what's the percentage of the workforce that's unionized?
Right now, 10%? It's 10% total. It's 10% total. It's 6% in the private sector, and it's about 35% in the public sector. And about half of union members in the United States work for government. And that's an important thing to remember as well. When people talk about union members as blue-collar jobs or as the working class, half of the people who are union members in the United States are working for the government. They are not, working on a construction site. They're not working in a car factory. They're bureaucrats doing government jobs. They're teachers. They're policemen. They're firefighters. They're all of that kind of thing, which is not usually who we're talking about. And many of them have extremely generous benefit packages that were negotiated by those unions. And so these are not sort of the downtrodden masses that you're supporting if you say that you support unions in the United States. And so I don't think this long-term trend is really going to turn around. The only difference is what the Democrats will do about unions as they continue to fall apart. So we've seen in recent years, part of the American Rescue Plan Act was a huge bailout for union pension funds, private sector union pension funds. And those bailouts were given with no conditions whatsoever. So they didn't have to prove that they've reformed the funds. They didn't have to prove that they did anything to make them solvent. They just got billions and billions of dollars from the taxpayers to keep paying benefits that are unsustainable. So that's the kind of thing that Democrats will continue to do because unions are a very important part of their political coalition. They donate to their campaigns, but more importantly than that, they supply the volunteers and the labor force to go out and run campaigns, to knock on people's doors, to make phone calls, to do all that kind of stuff. And so it's a very important part of the Democrats' political coalition. We need to understand unions as being primarily political organizations and not labor organizations. Because again, if they were really labor organizations, more people would want to join them because, it would be nice to have a group that came together and represented you and advocated on your behalf in the workplace. But that's not what unions generally do in the United States. They're generally political organizations, and that's why a lot of people want to get out of them. And that's why a lot of the people who are left in them are also ones who agree with their political advocacy. And that's why you see them being so much stronger in the public sector than in the private sector.
Akash, what do you think this continued kind of push for unions does to their industrial policy plans?
I think politically it makes sense, but functionally it is unworkable, right? Industrial policy is already unworkable. When you pile on a bunch of union mandates, project labor agreements, collective bargaining requirements and things like that, I think it just makes it prohibitively difficult to function. It tightens up the labor market in a way that makes it impossible to fill jobs. And I think it's just another example of why this stuff just cannot work.
I want to go back a little bit to affordability. So part of what Harris said when she talked about the tax credit for first-time home owners, and I think there's also a tax credit for contractors or builders. I think there are a bunch of things like this, is like the promise of building 3 million new homes, and that she actually talked about permitting reforms, which I was surprised to hear and glad to hear. Do you think that, and obviously a lot of the permitting reform that needs to take place at the local and state level. That's a very big, important part of the equation. But at the federal level, there are things that are really making building things in America much, very, very expensive. NEPA, there's a lot of regulations and permitting, and basically we have a really permission slip type economy, right? If you want to build, you have to first ask for lots of permission, and it takes years. Do you guys think that there's any chance the Democrats deliver on this? And because there are a lot of people, Matt Iglesias, Ezra Klein, Derek Thompson, Noah Smith, these guys, center left, they're believing in an abundance agenda, and that requires a lot of changes that allows to build.
It's really hard to take it seriously coming from Kamala Harris, who is, the vice president for Joe Biden. Dan Goldbeck at the American Action Forum, he keeps track of regulations and the regulatory costs from final rules that have been added by each presidential administration, each of the last 3 presidential administrations up to this point in their term. So he's looking at through August 16th. So through August 16th of the 4th year of a presidential administration, Barack Obama, he added $311 billion worth of regulations to the economy. Okay, that's a lot. $311 billion. Trump subtracted about $100 billion up to this point. Okay, so that's already a pretty big difference, right? That's a roughly $400 billion difference between Democrats and Republicans coming in. Biden so far has added $1.7 trillion worth of regulations. Okay, so this is way more than Obama added. And it's the complete opposite of Trump, who actually slightly reduced the regulatory burden. up to this point in his presidency. And so for someone from the Biden administration to be talking about cutting red tape after adding $1.7 trillion worth of red tape in not even a full presidential term, that's pretty hard to take seriously.
And by the way, during her speech on that Friday, I think it was a week ago, roughly, no one applauded when she said she was going to cut red tape, if you noticed. But Akash, what do you think?
Yeah, I think Dominic makes a great point that there's just like zero track record by which to assess this. And even though there are some sort of progressive favored projects that would benefit, like green energy infrastructure projects and things like that, from doing so, I think the constituencies that stand to lose out from doing things like this, which are kind of, the unions come to mind as a very obvious one, the trial lawyers, the environmental movement. I mean, they lose out ultimately the more that we are able to build things and grow the economy, and the more that a rising tide lifts all boats. I think these are groups that are essential to the Democratic coalition and ultimately are likely to stand in the way of something like this, at least on a broad scale. Okay,
so no deregulation coming from the Harris
I think we might see some very, very narrowly targeted deregulation in areas like green energy infrastructure, but absolutely not on a broad-based scale that's necessary to choose.
And in fact, I mean, this is, I think, one of my bigger beef with industrial policy, right? Is that often, I was talking with someone yesterday about the CHIPS Act, which was passed on the bipartisan basis. Granted, it was not a lot of Republicans who voted for this. Lots of subsidies to semiconductors and to semiconductor companies like Intel that would have probably done it if there was an opportunity. Because one of the way it's sold is that actually there are a lot of fabless companies that would really like to diversify and not just have their chips built in Taiwan. And so there's a demand. So if that's true, then it means that Intel would have done it without the subsidy. And then to that, people say, well, then it's going to be maybe a chance to actually streamline a lot of the regulations. And that's actually really precisely my problem with industrial policy. If we recognize that streamlining, the basically getting rid of all these points of friction that are preventing and making it hard to build for semiconductors, and why not do it for everyone? Just like rather than actually spend $52 billion that you extend to semiconductor companies, not all of them Americans. In fact, I think kind of Intel is like the only one, right? Why not just begin with doing all the permitting reform and all the deregulation? That's actually my number one. It's like they do everything in reverse.
It's the same thing with taxes, right? So, the Democrats say that the Republicans are evil for cutting the corporate tax for every business, right? From one of the highest rates in the world to just the average rate in the world. And they say that this is a huge giveaway to big corporations or whatever. But Harris is proposing giving $90 billion worth of tax breaks just to home builders. Why is that fair? Why shouldn't we reduce the tax burden for every company in the United States instead of just picking certain ones that we want to help out? So I think it's the same thing there.
Yeah, that's adding lines to the tax expenditure tables, right? I mean, it's like all these carve outs that make the tax code just so unfair and so complicated and inefficient. I want to ask you another proposal. It did sound like she repeated the national rent control idea that President Biden floated like a few weeks ago, and that just no one really paid any attention to. Is that your understanding too, Akash?
Yeah. She has not distanced herself from any of these things, I think. But as you mentioned, no one really paid attention to it. All of these things really just amount to kind of empty campaign promises. The rent control one, I think, is particularly amusing given that she's from California, where we have seen, like a lot of policies, but this one in particular in housing, just be an absolute nightmare for the middle class, for the lower middle class, which is that if you don't qualify for rent control and you're not very, very wealthy, you are being literally priced out of living in California, or at least living anywhere near where there are employment opportunities. I mean, people are, for example, they're living far enough that they have to drive like 2, sometimes 3 hours to get to work in the Bay Area in San Francisco, because these affordable housing, rent control policies are just pushing the supply away from them and away from being accessible to sort of average middle class people. And that's why people are fleeing her home state of California. The idea of taking a policy like that nationally is just beyond ridiculous, frankly.
Now, it's my final question to both of you. Is there any of the policies that strike you that you think we can expect from a Harris Walz administration that we haven't talked about and you'd like people to know about?
The one that comes to mind for me that's kind of a question mark is trade policy. I mean, I fully expect her to continue the unfortunate status quo of protectionism, given, again, how important labor unions are to the Democratic coalition. They are enormously protectionist. But again, trade is essential to economic growth. It's essential to domestic manufacturing. It's essential to lowering costs for American families. And so I don't expect that to be something that she expounds on in great detail on the campaign trail. She hasn't expounded in great detail on anything. I wouldn't anticipate trade to be that, but I think that's an important question mark in the Harris agenda.
It's actually a good reminder about what Dominic said about labor unions being really working for the Democratic Party, because if there's one party that is openly and proudly protectionist, it's the Republicans, under Trump, obviously, even though Biden has really doubled down on the Trump tariffs and actually added tariffs of his own. And Harris is she does have an America first type way of talking about things. So we can expect the same, but nonetheless, Trump makes no secret that he's a protectionist, and yet he's tried to court unions and it's just not working.
Well, and if unions actually supported the American workers, they would be calling for the reduction of lots of tariffs as well, right? It makes perfect sense. The steelworkers union wants steel tariffs, but for all of the other manufacturing industries, steel tariffs just mean that they have higher input costs, and higher input costs mean that they're not able to pay workers as much, they're not able to hire as many workers when they have to pay double or triple the world price for steel. So, the United Auto Workers, for example, they should be out there banging the table, asking for the removal of tariffs so that the car companies can buy inputs cheaper, so that more United Auto Workers members can work on them. But they don't do that because it really is just about politics. But to answer your question about Harris Walz policy that I'm thinking about, I'm interested in sort of the balance between state, local governments and the federal government. I think a big part of the reason why Tim Walz was selected as the running mate for Harris is that he did Bidenomics at the state level better than any other governor. He spent all of the money from the American Rescue Plan Act faster than any other governor. He put it all into lots of different programs for progressive ideological reasons, stuff about universal basic income programs, stuff about different sorts of DEI initiatives and things like that. But he also used it to fund things like paying teachers, stuff that that state governments have to do every year. And he funded it with one-time money from the federal government. And so he got all that money out the door, got it all to the right interest groups, and I think he was rewarded for that with a spot on the presidential ticket. And so, if he's the winner, and if Harris is the winner, going into 2025, that's when a lot of this money is going to start running out. Under the American Rescue Plan Act, states had to obligate their spending by the end of this year, and then they have to actually spend the money by the end of 2026. So right in the middle of the next presidential term, that money is going to expire. And a lot of states are going to come back to the federal government and they're going to say, we need more money to pay teachers. We need more money to do this stuff. And they're going to have very, very sympathetic cases because no one wants teachers to go unpaid. And so this is going to be a situation where the federal government is going to have to make a choice. Are state governments actually responsible for their finances, or are they just wards of the federal government? And if they're just wards of the federal government, that is a big change in American federalism. I think that could be coming if Kamala Harris and Tim Walz win in 2024.
Well, we're going to have to wrap it up. Thank you so much, guys. I mean, thank you for helping me try to decipher through the vagueness what this could look like. And it's kind of very unappealing to me, but thank you.
Thank you, Vero.
Thanks.